She feigned silence to stay alive, until the nobleman discovered the truth. He stared at the woman who had finally, desperately whispered his name. Lord Alistair St. Clair did not see the trembling of her hands or the predator lurking just paces behind her. He saw only the companion who had deceived his household, the woman who had made his logic look like a lover's blindness. In that chilling, quiet second, the stern pragmatism that defined the Master Blackwood turned into a wall of stone. He turned his back on her, breached the walls. Her shield was gone. She was no longer a ghost. She was prey. Before we deep into the story, please let me know in a comment where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow I have another beautiful story to share with you, and I don't want you to miss it anything. Now, let's get into the story. It was not a rebuke. It was a death warrant. The abandonment was absolute. Isolde's world fractured. The man she thought would be her sanctuary had just surrendered her to the Reaper. She looked toward the foyer. Julian was there, a jagged, victorious grin twisting his face. He had the survival instinct that had kept her mute for a year snapped. She didn't explain. She dropped the heavy silver candelabra, and the ring of brass on stone shattered the room's suffocating silence. She fled. She pushed past the gasping housemaids, through the dark service tunnels, and up to the isolation of the east wing. She threw the bolt on her door, gasping in the dark, a prisoner in the very house where her monster now sat at the dinner table. In the master study, Alistair slammed his crystal glass against the hearth. It exploded into glittering shards. She used me. She made me a guardian of a lie. He was reaching for the decanter, his pulse thundering with wounded pride, when the heavy oak door swung open. It was his mother, the Dowager Lady St. Clair. She was a woman who navigated the world through leverage and bloodlines, and she had just seen her son fail the most basic test of a nobleman. She did not see a servant's deceit. She saw a daughter of the peerage fighting a war alone. "You are a small man, Alistair," she said, her voice a frozen blade. "Get out," he barked. "I have already had that butcher, Julian, and his men escorted to the gatehouse under guard," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "While you were in here nursing your bruised ego, I acted." Alistair froze, the decanter midair. "She played us for fools," he roared. "She was surviving." His mother's voice was a whip crack that echoed off the leather-bound books. That was the sound of a woman who has seen the abyss. You were the only light she had left, and you snuffed it out to protect your vanity. She stepped closer, her disappointment radiating like heat. "You proved her right. You proved that your reputation is worth more than her life." She turned to leave, offering no map to Isolde's room and no instructions for his redemption. She left him alone in the suffocating silence of his own pride. The carriage wheels groaned against the jagged gravel of the Blackwood Hall drive, sounding to Isolde Vance like the closing of a tomb. She clutched her small, travel-worn valise to her chest, her knuckles white against the dark fabric of her cloak. She was no longer the daughter of a marquis. She was Eleanor Wright, a woman whose voice had been stolen by a tragedy she could never speak of. As the great iron-studded door swung open, the scent of damp stone and ancient wax rushed to meet her, cold and indifferent. Standing in the center of the vaulted foyer was Lord Alistair St. Clair. He was a man composed of sharp angles and deep shadows, his presence commanding the very air in the room. His eyes, a piercing and judgmental gray, swept over her with the clinical detachment of a magistrate. Isolde felt a phantom tremor in her throat, the urge to scream, to plead, to explain, but she swallowed it down, burying the impulse in the shallow grave where her identity now rested. With a trembling hand, she reached into her pocket and produced a folded parchment. It was a medical certificate, forged with desperate precision, stating that a profound shock had rendered her mute. Alistair took the paper, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting, electric second that made her breath hitch in her lungs. He read the document in a silence, so heavy it felt like a physical weight. "A companion who cannot converse," he mused, his voice a low, melodic baritone that vibrated through the stone floor. He stepped closer, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "My mother requires a steady hand and a calm presence, Miss Wright. But Blackwood is a house built on secrets. I wonder if you have the constitution to keep them, or if your silence is merely a mask for something more treacherous." Isolde met his gaze, forcing her expression into one of docile tragedy even as her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She offered a slow, graceful tilt of her head, a servant submission. Alistair studied her for a moment longer, his eyes searching hers for a crack in the armor, a flicker of the high-born fire he sensed beneath her drab exterior. "Very well," he said finally, handing the certificate to the waiting housekeeper. "See that she is settled in the servants' wing. And remind her that in this house, silence is respected, but deceit is never forgiven." As he turned his back on her, Isolde let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She had breached the walls. She was safe for now, a ghost among the living, praying that the man with the piercing eyes would never look closely enough to see the fugitive hiding behind her quiet lips. The transition from fugitive to servant was a transition into a world of rhythmic, muted precision. As a companion to the Dowager Lady St. Clair, Isolde learned the geography of Blackwood Hall, not by its grand vistas, but by the grain of its oak wainscoting and the weight of silver tea services. She became a master of the soft footfall, moving through the echoing hallways like a silhouette cast by candlelight. Her silence, once a desperate improvisation, was now her most professional attribute. It allowed her to fade into the tapestry of the house, becoming a fixture that the inhabitants eventually stopped noticing. However, Lord Alistair was not a man who stopped noticing. Isolde soon realized that his cold exterior was not fueled by cruelty, but by a relentless, almost surgical devotion to the law. Her duties often brought her past the threshold of his private study, where the door was frequently left ajar. Inside, the walls were lined not with poetry or fiction, but with leather-bound volumes of judicial precedent and half-rolled maps of the local circuits. She watched from the shadows as he labored late into the night, his brow furrowed over stacks of depositions, his pen scratching against parchment with the finality of a guillotine. One afternoon, while arranging hydrangeas in the gallery, Isolde overheard Alistair's heated exchange with a local magistrate. "Evidence is not a matter of convenience, sir." Alistair's voice rang out, vibrated with a terrifying moral clarity. "If the man is guilty, he shall hang. But if the law has been bent to suit a grudge, I will dismantle your court to set it right. Justice is the only thing that keeps the darkness from the door." Isolde's pulse quickened, a cold sweat dampening her velvet collar. She stood paralyzed, a single blue petal fluttering from her hand to the floor. In Alistair, she saw a weapon of terrifying power. He was the very thing she needed to destroy her brother, Julian, a man who would not rest until every lie was unearthed. Yet, he was also the greatest threat to her survival. If Alistair's obsession with the truth ever turned toward his mother's silent companion, he would peel back her layers with that same merciless precision. He would see her forged certificate, her stolen name, and the blood-soaked secrets of her past. To him, a lie was a stain on the fabric of the world, and she was a living, breathing falsehood. As Alistair emerged from the study, his gaze caught hers across the long gallery. He paused, his eyes narrowing as they dropped to the fallen petal at her feet, and then back to her face. He didn't speak, but the intensity of his stare felt like an interrogation. Isolde bowed her head, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs, realizing that she was sheltering in the lion's den. The very justice he championed was a fire that could either light her way home or burn her alive. The sanctuary of Blackwood Hall began to feel like a tightening snare as the autumn wind stripped the trees bare. Isolde moved through the rooms with a ghost's grace. But even a ghost leaves a trace behind. It happened in the high-ceilinged morning room, beneath the watchful eyes of the St. Clair ancestors. While tidying the dowager's embroidery basket, a square of delicate ivory lace slipped from Isolde's sleeve, fluttering to the Persian rug like a dying butterfly. It was a relic of her former life, a fine silk handkerchief she had clutched in the carriage during her frantic escape. Too precious and too dangerous to keep, yet impossible to throw away. She did not notice its absence until she was halfway down the servants' corridor. By then, the room was no longer empty. Lord Alistair had entered to consult his mother, but his gaze, ever trained to spot the anomaly in a landscape of order, fell immediately to the floor. He stooped to retrieve the scrap of fabric. It was too soft for a commoner, too intricate for a companion, whose wages barely covered the cost of her simple cotton gowns. As he turned it over in his large hand, His thumb brushed over the corner where a tiny, meticulous crest was embroidered in silver thread, the crown and ivy of the House of Vance. Alistair's expression did not change, but his gray eyes darkened with the cold intensity of a predator who had finally found the scent. He knew every noble crest in the kingdom. It was his business to know who held the land and who held the power. The Vance family had been decimated by tragedy and scandal months ago, their name whispered in the same breath as murder. To find their mark in the possession of a mute servant was not merely a curiosity, it was a provocation. When Isolde returned to the room, her breath caught. Alistair was standing by the window, the handkerchief draped over his fingers. The light caught the silver threading, making the crest shimmer with accusing clarity. He didn't hand it back. Instead, he watched her approach, his silence more demanding than any shout. Isolde felt the blood drain from her face, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the walls of her chest. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she gestured for the lace, her eyes wide with a carefully curated plea for mercy. "This is a fine piece of work, Miss Wright," Alistair said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He stepped closer, invading her personal space until she could smell the faint scent of sandalwood and old parchment that clung to him. "Extraordinary work for a woman of your station. It suggests a history that your papers failed to mention." He let the silk fall into her palm, his touch lingering just long enough to feel the frantic pulse in her wrist. He didn't ask for an explanation. He knew she wouldn't give one. But as he walked past her, his shoulder brushing hers, the warning was clear. The predator was no longer merely curious. He was hunting. From that moment on, every step she took and every shadow she inhabited was under the unwavering surveillance of a man who viewed a hidden truth as a personal affront to justice. The storm broke over Blackwood Hall with a violence that mirrored the upheaval in Isolde's soul. Thunder shook the heavy foundation stones, and lightning seared through the darkness, momentarily turning the rain-streaked windows of the library into sheets of white fire. Unable to sleep with the ghost of the Vance crest haunting her mind, Isolde had sought refuge among the towering shelves, the scent of old leather and vanilla acting as a fragile sedative. She moved without a lamp, the rhythmic flashes of light sufficient to guide her fingers along the spines of books that whispered of a world where justice was poetic and truth was a virtue, not a death sentence. A sudden, sharp crack of thunder coincided with a heavy groan of the library door. Isolde froze, her hand resting on a volume of Virgil, her breath hitching in her throat. Lord Alistair stood in the threshold, his silhouette framed by the dim amber glow of a single candle he carried. He was unbuttoned at the collar, his dark hair dampened by the mist of the storm, looking less like a magistrate and more like a man plagued by his own restless demons. He did not ask what she was doing there at midnight. He simply watched her, the flickering flame casting long, dancing shadows across his sharp features. The distance between them felt charged with the electricity of the gale outside. Alistair crossed the room with a deliberate, slow stride, setting the candle on a low mahogany table. He didn't demand an explanation for her presence, nor did he rebuke her for trespassing. Instead, he reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the bookshelf. "You read the classics," he observed, his voice a low, rough velvet that seemed to vibrate in the small space between them. "I have seen you trace the titles when you think no one is looking. You possess the soul of a scholar trapped in the life of a phantom." Isolde looked up at him, the silver light of a lightning strike illuminating the raw vulnerability in her eyes. For the first time, she did not look away. The silence between them shifted. It was no longer a wall of deceit, but a bridge. Alistair's gaze dropped to her lips, then back to her eyes, searching for confession she couldn't speak. He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that shattered her composure more than any interrogation ever could. It was a wordless acknowledgment that he saw her, not as the mute companion, but as a woman of equal fire and hidden depths. In that midnight library, the hierarchy of Blackwood Hall dissolved into shadows. The master and the servant were gone, replaced by two lonely souls anchored to one another by the weight of a secret that was beginning to feel more like a promise than a threat. The fragile peace of the library dissolved like mist under the harsh morning light that flooded the breakfast parlor. Isolde was pouring tea for the dowager when the morning post arrived, and with it, the cold wind of her past. Alistair sat at the head of the table, his presence as sharp and unyielding as the silver letter opener he used to slice through the wax seals. He read the local gazette with his usual detached focus until his hand stilled, his eyes narrowing at a particular social announcement. "It seems we are that prestigious company in the county," Alistair remarked, his voice carrying that low, resonant authority that usually grounded Isolde, but now made her blood turn to ice. "Julian Vance, the new Marquis of Vance, has taken residence at the Thorn Estate just 5 miles to the south. He is reportedly searching for his sister, who remains missing after the unfortunate business with their father's estate." At the sound of that name, Julian, the world tilted on its axis. The porcelain teapot in Isolde's hand suddenly felt like a leaden weight. A violent tremor seized her arm, a physical manifestation of the terror she had spent a year suppressing. The spout clattered against the rim of the china cup, a frantic, rhythmic metallic tapping that echoed through the quiet room like a heartbeat. A dark stain of Earl Grey bloomed across the pristine white linen of the tablecloth, spreading like the blood she had seen on her brother's sleeves. Isolde's breath came in shallow, jagged gasps that she couldn't hide. Her knees buckled slightly, and she had to grip the edge of the sideboard to keep from collapsing. The silence she had cultivated as a shield now felt like a vacuum, choking her. She could feel Julian's presence as if he were already in the room, his shadow stretching across the 5 miles to find the throat of the only witness to his crimes. Across the table, Alistair did not look back at the paper. His gaze was fixed entirely on Isolde. He saw the sudden, deathly pallor of her skin and the way her pupils blown wide with primitive, undeniable fear. He noted how her hands shook with such violence that she had to tuck them into the folds of her apron. Most tellingly, he saw her flinch at the mere mention of a name she should not, as a simple servant from the north, even recognize. "You look as though you've seen a ghost, Miss Wright," Alistair said softly, though the edge in his voice was as keen as a razor. He rose slowly from his chair, walking around the table until he stood directly in her line of sight. He reached out, not to comfort her, but to gently tilt her chin upward, forcing her to meet his inquisitive, searching stare. "It is a strange thing for a girl who cannot speak to have such a loud reaction to the name of a marquis. One might almost think you were listening for his footsteps." The stone walls of the corridor seemed to shrink inward, trapping the air between them as Alistair closed the distance. Isolde retreated until the cold masonry pressed against her spine, her hands instinctively flying to her chest, clutching her shawl as if it were a suit of armor. In the dim, flickering light of the wall sconce, Alistair's shadow loomed over her, broad and inescapable. He did not shout. His voice was a low, jagged rasp that cut through the silence of Blackwood home more effectively than a blade. "The game has reached its end, Isolde," he said, using her true name for the first time, the syllables sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. He stepped into her personal space, his hand striking the stone wall beside her head with a dull thud, effectively pinning her in place. He looked at her exactly as he did in the shadowed hallway, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and a desperate, burgeoning protectiveness. "I have seen the way you flinch at the mention of the Vance name. I have seen the education you tried so hard to bury. You are not a mute servant. You are a woman fleeing a monster. Tell me his name. Tell me who has turned a daughter of noble blood into a ghost." Isolde's breath came in ragged, visible hitches. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and shimmering with unshed tears, yet she remained resolutely silent. She raised a trembling hand, pressing a single finger to her lips in the universal gesture of a secret kept under pain of death. It was a physical manifestation of the vow she had taken the night she saw the blood on Julian's hands, a vow that silence was the only thing keeping her heart beating. "I can protect you," Alistair urged, his voice softening, losing its edge of interrogation and replacing it with raw, heavy sincerity. He reached out with his free hand, his thumb grazing the line of her jaw, pleading for a single word, a single confession. "I am a man of the law, Isolde. Give me the truth, and I will make this house a fortress that no brother or butcher can breach. I promise you safety. I promise you justice." For a heartbeat, the resolve in her eyes wavered. She wanted to collapse against his chest and let the story pour out of her like a flood. But the image of Julian's cold, triumphant smile flashed in her mind. The knowledge that anyone she trusted became a target. To speak was to pull Alistair into the path of a murderer. With a final, heartbreaking shake of her head, she pulled away from his touch, her lips pressed into a thin, white line. She would not break, even with the man she was beginning to love offering her the world. She chose the cold sanctuary of her silence, leaving Alistair standing alone in the shadows, his promise of safety echoing uselessly against the unyielding stone. The air inside Blackwood Hall grew thick and suffocating as the carriage wheels of the evening's guests crunched upon the gravel, sounding like the snapping of dry bone. A grand dinner party was Alistair's mother's way of asserting dominance in the county, but for Isolde, it was an invitation to an execution. She had spent the evening tucked into the deepest shadows of the pantry, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until the head butler's sharp command forced her into the light. Clad in her somber servant's uniform, she was handed a tray of crystal flutes and sent into the lion's den. The drawing room was a blur of glittering jewels and forced laughter, but Isolde saw only one face. Standing by the hearth, swirling a glass of amber brandy, was Julian. He looked every bit the noble Marquis, his calculated charm masking the rot beneath. The sight of him sent a jolt of visceral terror through her, a cold sweat drenching her skin beneath her stiff collar. As she moved through the crowd, she kept her head bowed, her silver tray acting as a shield between her and the man who had murdered their father. It became a breathless, agonizing game of hide-and-seek. Every time Julian turned his head, Isolde ducked behind a velvet curtain or vanished into the shadow of a marble pillar. She moved with the desperate agility of a cornered animal, weaving through the guests with her eyes fixed on the floor. At one point, Julian stepped directly into her path to greet a passing countess. Isolde froze, her breath hitching, her world narrowing down to the polished tips of his leather boots. She could hear the smooth, deceptive cadence of his voice, the same voice that had ordered her death, and took every ounce of her will not to scream. Alistair watched her from across the room, his jaw tight, his gray eyes tracking her panic movements with a mixture of growing fury and profound concern. He saw the way she nearly dropped the tray when Julian laughed. He saw the way she pressed herself into the shadows of the library door to escape his line of sight. The predator was in the house, and the prey was running out of room to hide. When Julian finally turned his gaze toward the staff, scanning the faces of the servants with a casual, predatory curiosity, Isolde felt the last of her courage fail. She ducked into the darkened dining room just as his eyes swept past her, her lungs burning, realizing that the walls of Blackwood Hall were no longer thick enough to keep the monster out. The stillness of the library was shattered not by the storm, but by the cold click of a pistol's hammer. Alistair stood near the hearth, his face a mask of defiant stone as Julian's hired men emerged from the shadows of the terrace, their blades drawn and eyes devoid of mercy. Julian stepped forward, the mask of the charming Marquis, discarded to reveal the rot of a murderer. He looked at Alistair with a sick, triumphant smile, realizing that by removing the master of the house, he could finally reclaim the sister who had seen too much. Isolde watched from the darkened balcony above, her body paralyzed by the familiar grip of terror. She saw the glint of steel aimed at Alistair's back. She saw the man she loved preparing to die for a justice he didn't yet fully understand. The silence that had been her sanctuary for a year suddenly felt like a physical weight, a suffocating shroud that was helping the monster win. The memory of her father's final breath collided with the sight of Alistair's steady gaze, and the wall inside her, the one built of trauma and survival, finally cracked. Behind you, the scream tore from her throat, raw and piercing, a sound that had been buried in a shallow grave for 300 days. It was not the whisper of a servant, but the command of advance. The sudden, violent intrusion of her voice broke the spell of the room. Alistair reacted with the instinct of a soldier, spinning to disarm the nearest assassin as the heavy library doors burst open. The guards, alerted by the unprecedented cry, flooded the room. Isolde descended the stairs, her legs trembling but her head held high. She did not stop until she stood beside Alistair, her hand finding his in a grip of iron. As Julian backed away, his face pale with the shock of her resurrection, Isolde spoke again. Her voice was steady, a clear, melodic chime of truth that filled every corner of the high-vaulted room. She detailed the night of the assassination, the blood on the sleeves, and the 4 deeds stripping Julian of his title with every syllable. The arrest was swift and silent, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded it. As the iron gates of Blackwood closed on the last of the shadows, the house breathed a collective sigh of relief. The silence was gone, but it was replaced by a new, resonant life. In the quiet aftermath, Alistair turned to her, his gray eyes no longer searching for a riddle, but resting on the woman who had finally come home. She was no longer a phantom in blue velvet, but the Lady of Blackwood, a woman who had found that her voice was the only weapon strong enough to truly set her free. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed the story, you will surely love the next one. It is crazy as more intriguing as you can ever image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.